William Myhill, who's the interim director and ADA 503-504 coordinator in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And then, as I said, my colleague, Beth Myers, who's the assistant director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion and the executive director of the Taysha Center for Inclusive Higher Ed. So I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of what the Center on Disability Inclusion is, and then what the specific project is that this is connected to. So the CDI, which officially launched in 2020, but is an umbrella organization that encompasses several centers focused on disability. Specifically, we're a disability-related research center working to develop and implement initiatives promoting the inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of school and society, locally and globally. So we are really interested in disability across the lifespan. There are a series of photos on this. In the top right-hand corner of your screen is a teacher ed candidate working with a student and leaning over his desk. The bottom right hand, we see two folks walking with a person using a motorized wheelchair in between them. Bottom left hand, we see a young man pointing to an external keyboard for communication. That device is being held by a support person. And in the upper left hand, we see four individuals, three of whom are female identifying, one who is male identifying, engaged in conversation. This particular project of the CDI grows out of the work of from a donor. Karen Siebold is a parent who has a daughter who identifies as autistic, and that daughter is a college student. And she's really seen that while her daughter's had some really phenomenal higher education experiences, her journey through college has not been as smooth as perhaps it could have been if the faculty, staff, and of that university had a better understanding of ways to support and meet her daughter where she is. So this really wonderful donor gave us money to start a pilot project focusing on neurodiversity on SU's campus. And we spent our fall really trying to talk with and learn from students. We didn't want to design a bunch of programs and services that weren't needed or weren't wanted. So in our initial conversations with autistic and neurodiverse students on our campus, four main things came out of those discussions from them. One was a desire to improve climate on campus, both the physical spaces in terms of being more sensory friendly, opportunities for movement, understanding where there are those sensory spaces on campus, and the larger sort of climate around really trying to work against ableism on campus. The second, they really wanted opportunities and space to connect, socially, engage with each other, meet other folks who identify as neurodiverse, and really get a chance to build networks across campus affiliations. They wanted some targeted learning opportunities for themselves around topics like organization, executive function, self-advocacy. But the fourth piece that came up from multiple individuals was a desire to see us build capacity of faculty and staff on campus around working with a neurodiverse population. So that's why we're here today. So I'm just going to do the introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to colleagues to take us from there. And I'm going to introduce what is neurodiversity. It's a term that's actually become much more prevalent in our popular culture. And in some ways, it's as with any language, it gets diluted and shifted and changed. So this is how we're defining neurodiversity. And there are, of course, multiple definitions. From my perspective, it's the idea that we expect, recognize, and in fact celebrate that there's a diversity of human brains and minds and bodies, that should be expected, that there's not a normate brain that we're all supposed to have, and that these differences are an expected part of human variation and not a deficit to be fixed. This is not about identifying what is wrong with somebody and making it better. It's recognizing we all get through the world and engage with the world in different ways. And that students, and I should add faculty and staff, this isn't just students, but this is really from a student perspective. No one should have to change who they are to conform with some socially constructed notion of a normate body or a normative performance standard. It is about looking normal. It is not about trying to approach a non-disabled existence. It's about recognizing that people should get to be who they are without fear of marginalization, othering, oppression, or denial of opportunity. But what gets counted under that big umbrella of neurodiversity? I just listed a few things. What we like about it is that really anybody can decide if they feel like they fit within that community. But we typically think about autism, ADD or ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's. But there's lots of things that fit under this sort of umbrella of neurodiversity. I included one link here. We'll have other resources, but this is a link to some common definitions that help explain neurodiversity from the perspective of Nick Walker, who's written extensively about this. And so I'm just going to share, we're not going to do a lot of reading of text today, but I think it's really important to start to center this from a neurodiverse perspective. So this is according to Nick Walker. He wrote this in 2021. The neurodiversity paradigm starts from the understanding that neurodiversity is an axis of human diversity, like ethnic diversity or diversity of gender and sexual orientation, and is subject to the same sort of social dynamics as those other forms of diversity, including dynamics of social power inequalities, privilege, and oppression. From this perspective, the pathologization of neural minorities can be recognized as simply another form of systemic oppression, which functions similar to the oppression of other types of minority groups. We frame, as you can see, our notion of neurodiversity as that this is akin to other forms of minoritized identities, and that we need to frame this as an issue of disability justice while we frame it as an issue of access and changing cultures and climates on campus. So that's just a little bit. We could spend a lot more time talking about framing, but I want to jump into hearing from our next panelist. And Nate, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and then share. Oh, sorry. I got ahead of myself. I had one more slide I wanted to say. Nate, I apologize.
All right.
Before I turn it over to Nate, and this is why we're doing this, my general approach to this work starts from a perspective of ask the student. Ask the staff member, ask the autistic person, ask the person who identifies as part of the neurodiversity community. If you want to know how best to support someone, ask them. Then we're going to begin with universal design for learning, which William's going to talk about today. Provide structure and flexibility. And those things may seem counterintuitive, but they're not. Clear structures, clear expectations, but with flexibility. Recognize that there's an interplay between the demands of a situation and context and how someone functions in that context. So the role of differing environmental demands or workload demands or social demands and how that impacts how people can engage so that it's not static, it's very dynamic. And then again, ask the student. So I start and end there because that should be our overall message. So I want to turn to a student. Nate, would you introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about what it's like to be an autistic student at SU, and let me know when you would like me to advance slides.
Definitely. My name is Nate Hughes. I am a second-year doc student at Syracuse University. I identify as autistic, and I'm originally from Massachusetts. And I would like to kind of talk a little bit about my initial college experience because I did not attend Syracuse for my bachelor and master's programs. And so one of the things that I think is important to talk about is how my experience at Syracuse contrasts from my initial college experiences, which, to be honest, were not as, affirming as I would have liked them to have been. I attended local state colleges in Massachusetts after high school, like relatively close to where I grew up. I went to one that was initially 2 hours away, and then from my family home, and then I transferred after my freshman year to one that was a bit closer by, so that I could more easily access supports from my family and friends that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I went to initially I went to Westfield State University and then Salem State University. The positives that I kind of got from those experiences were that the disability services for state colleges in the state of Massachusetts are quite robust. The first college I went to, the reason why I went there was because they had a whole building dedicated to disability services, and where I was assigned a specific counselor where I was given opportunities for accommodations that I would not have received at other colleges, perhaps like getting extended time on tests like that for as much time as I needed. Usually there's like a time limit to that. Also, when it comes to advanced registration for classes. And so that was helpful. But what some of the negatives that I kind of experienced was that there wasn't a lot of emphasis on neurodivergence or inclusion. And so I really did feel like when I was in these large state universities, I felt as though I was a small fish in a very, very, very big pond, almost like an ocean of 15 to 20,000 students in each school. And so I really desired a space, much like what we're offering here at Syracuse, where students who are neurodivergent can kind of come together and, promote advocacy, engage in social opportunities, all those types of things that like I really didn't get to have in these environments. I also went to Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts for my master's. I wanted to study what they call special education. And through that, I had to do a field experience. But because most colleges beyond Syracuse really look at special education in terms of a medicalized model that doesn't really focus on community and inclusion, they were not really supportive of the idea of me as someone with the strengths and challenges that I offer as someone on the autism spectrum. They did not really encourage my growth within the program to be a licensed educator. And so I struggled with the field experience with not getting the support and the accommodations that I needed. And so I decided not to pursue licensure at that time, even though I did get my master's degree in special education. But but I really did enjoy the academic aspect of school, which is why I wanted to get my doctorate. And so when I did that, I decided that I wanted to really go to a school that offered an inclusive atmosphere and an atmosphere that would be more affirming than what I've been accustomed to in the past. So if you can move to the next slide. So that was how I found Syracuse. I found that through a recommendation from actually an old professor from graduate school who had attended conferences with some of the inclusive education staff at Syracuse University and let me know of the atmosphere here and how this would likely be a great fit for me as someone who wanted to be part of a community that embraced neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And so, and when I was admitted, thankfully, I found this to be the case. I came in and I learned about some of the other models of disability that really did not focus on fixing, as Christy had previously mentioned, but rather affirming and kind of conserving disability as kind of something where we all kind of go about things in a way that is different and just kind of accepting that rather than just kind of looking at it from a way where it's wrong or unbroken. And this is something that I felt about myself from my previous experiences in kind of more formative education, college, all types of things. And so this was a great experience for me to just kind of like develop a positive self-concept of myself too. Also, the academic content that affirms and that affirmed that, as well as kind of challenged some of my previous beliefs of education that I had kind of learned from more oppressive institutions where special education was seen as something to help students with disabilities adjust to their environment rather than just affirm who they are as people. And so kind of learning from that angle was challenging at first because it wasn't what I was used to, but now I realized that it was such a great thing to model and kind of great pedagogical model to go off of for all students. And more emphasis on neurodivergence, as you can see through this very panel. I really had the opportunity to work with professors who wanted to ensure that neurodiverse and neurodivergent students had a successful university experience at all levels, whether that's undergrad, graduate, doctoral, you name it. So therefore, I kind of felt more at home here than in any other school that I'd been at in the past, because I always lived away from home when I went to college. And so that was something that was important for me to kind of have. So thank you so much. And now I will turn it over to the next panelist.
Great. William.
Thanks, Christy. Thank you, Nate. I'm grateful for you sharing some of your experience with us today, Nate. That's so important to this conversation. I'd like to talk a bit about what universal design for learning is and just provide a few examples of how it can be beneficial to us in our pedagogical practices, but it also has a lot of application in our day-to-day work environments. If we can go to, well, let me first introduce myself. I apologize. So I am Willie Michael. I am the interim ADA coordinator here at the university. And I'd like to point out the fact that this position was historically placed within the Equal Opportunity Office, but has been moved over to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And this is a really important shift. This is about understanding how disability inclusion is not merely compliance with the law. The law only goes so far, but inclusion needs to take in so much more than just what the law provides for. And it belongs, in my experience, disability belongs as a natural member of the family of diversity, which is why the home diversity inclusion is a really nice fit. So, universal design for learning. The UDL framework recognizes and honors the diverse lived and past learning experiences of students in the design of educational activities and assessments, and also acknowledges the myth of average. We have a small picture on this page. It's an image of a male presenting person with light brown skin, short dark hair, carrying a notebook and wearing a gray and green shirt. And then along an axis, it reads low, average, and high. And then 9 qualities are listed out along the other axis: memory, language, knowledge, reading, vocabulary, curiosity, perceptual, cognitive, and interest. And then there's a plot for this particular student. And what's interesting here is that the plot lands in a lot of different places between low and high. Of course, these are very artificial constructs. This is a sort of a general overview here. None of them really land on average, and that's because average is really a myth, and Christy was introducing this idea to us. We often think and teach and work with others as if there's one best way to do things, and if we do it the one best way, we're going to benefit the most people. That's a very utilitarian approach to things, but the reality is our learners are all over the map in terms of their strengths, their challenges, across a number of different types of skills or intelligences, as you may want to call them. And persons who identify as neurodiverse are no different. They have just as much of this diversity as everybody else. Let's go to the next slide, please. There are 3 constructs under universal design for learning: engagement, representation, and action and expression. And each of them recognizes that learners differ in the ways that they can, for example, be engaged or motivated to learn, which is the engagement area. Learners differ in the ways that they perceive and comprehend information. And action and expression, learners differ in the ways that they can navigate a learning environment and express what they know. Again, we often put together our lessons with expectations that students will come engaged. That's a natural state. That if we present in one particular way to our students, maybe it's a lecture, maybe it's a talk, a presentation, a group activity, if we present in just one way, then that is only really reaching a small group of students in your class who interact with that particular mode of representation the best. And the same for action and expression, which is thinking about how we can provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their growth, their learning, their achievements, not in a single way like a multiple choice test or an essay, but through a variety of potential opportunities. Christine mentioned the importance of structure and flexibility for students who are neurodiverse. And UDL, in many respects, in these examples, really speaks to that flexibility. That when we can provide more than one way for students to engage, more than one way that we represent information when we're bringing it to our students, and we can provide more than one way for the students to respond to those prompts, then we're actually going to reach a much wider cross-section of our students in terms of how they best interact with the curriculum. I don't want to overemphasize this in a sense that would suggest that neurodiversity is a deficit. But when we think about the myth of average, research has helped us to understand that among students who are neurodiverse, there tends to be more challenges with processing information, managing time, with engaging in group work, with making presentations, with being motivated to study, and attending and following lectures. Now, like any other disability, neurodiversity does not present in one particular way. Every student is going to be unique. These are just some things that are a little more common among students who are neurodiverse. So on to the next slide. What we have here is some of the one that's, you can go back a slide, please. Yes, this one. Thank you. When we think about supporting neurodiverse students, there are some particular components of UDL strategies that can help us with this. One of the resources you'll get at the end of this presentation is a link to all of the UDL guidelines. And what I have here are listed a few examples of them. And I want to sort of point to how they can help us think about some of the needs that our neurodiverse students might have. Focus. When we can actively and intentionally minimize threats and distractions in our classrooms, we can help not just those who are neurodiverse, but all of our students to focus better. So that can be by providing non-crowded spaces, spaced seating, eliminating drafts in a room, finding or using alternatives to fluorescent lighting, these types of things which can be triggering for students who are neurodiverse. If we eliminate these things, we make the environment more comfortable for all students and increase their ability to focus. When it comes to motivation, it's very important to think about how we optimize the relevance, value, and authenticity of things. How we bring to the class, for example, materials that represent a diverse experience, diverse lived experiences. If we are only presenting, for example, materials that our students interact with that present a white, able-bodied experience, then we're not giving them an opportunity to relate to the content that we're presenting, and it has less relevance to them. So it's very important that we think about different ways to motivate students by bringing more authentic materials into our classes. In the sense of, or in regard to representation, guiding information processing and visualization can be a great way to help students who are identified as neurodiverse. One of the ways to do that is sometimes called priming, or providing advanced agendas or schedules of what's going to happen in a class, so that people can have a clear understanding and not be surprised by what's going to happen in that space. It creates a kind of predictability which is beneficial for all students. And then when we think about action and expression, a couple of examples of how UDL can help us here. The varying of the methods for response and navigation. When we provide alternatives for responding to content or prompts, perhaps these are through handwriting or texting, or through a phone app that's interactive, or through physical movement, through drawing, through another means of demonstrating a skill. And we're varying the ways that students can demonstrate what they're learning in our spaces. And then organizational skills. When we provide graphic organizers, templates, checklists, or guides for note-taking, we are creating the scaffold that help all students with their organizational skills. These are just a few examples that we can pull from Universal Design for Learning that can speak to addressing some of the challenges that our neurodiverse students commonly have, but at the same time benefit all the students in our classes. With that, I will pass it back to you, Christy.
Thank you, William. Yes, I mean, I think you're hearing a recurring theme, being proactive and thinking about the widest range of possible users in a space, while also recognizing some students are going to need particular individualized supports. And I'm going to turn next to our last panelist, and then we're going to open it up for lots of discussion. But our final panelist, sorry, my mouse has disappeared. There we go. Judy Kopp.
Hi, everyone. It was great to see so many familiar names and faces on the panel. I'm Judy Kopp. I'm the Assistant Director in the Center for Disability Resources. And what I want to talk about, we can go to the next slide too, is really the types of resources that we have for the faculty, staff and TAs. And I think many who do teach at this university are familiar with a lot of our services. And these are really for individualized accommodations when, like some of these practices of universal design are not able to be fully met within the classroom. Because ideally, through universal design, I would be out of a job. So I put down some things that are like direct support that we have for faculty and TAs, like our exam services, and just helping to brainstorm some classroom strategies with students. We're here for those types of resources, and assisting with the implementation of accommodations when individualized accommodations are necessary. We also want to be able to provide additional supports to the students, discussing alternate types of accommodations and classroom and lab systems. And I'll stop right there. I'll give some examples. So with universal design and with, thinking about the neurodiverse student, there are times when students may come to us, like their biggest concern, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I say this, is that they want their faculty to see them as competent and qualified to be in the classroom. They don't want to come off as, not belonging. So it's very hard to sometimes ask for alternate accommodations, or sometimes even to ask for accommodations. But we're here to support the students and the faculty. I'll give an example. Just this past week, I had a student who was in a class where the students were required to memorize 240 terms. And then they would be given a test on 50 of those terms, the definitions. And the student was overwhelmed by the number and was really struggling with the time frame. And we discussed different ways to maybe, was it more time, or was it the content, or was it the amount? And working with the professor, we determined that if the student could have an alternate assignment and take 50 terms and provide definitions. And then when I was helping out in this situation, I asked the professor, do you want the student to learn these 50 terms and then be tested on the 50 terms, or to learn the 50 terms and demonstrate somehow that they know these 50 terms? And the professor said, let's let her decide. So that goes back to Christy's original thing, is ask the student. It was a great solution. I think everyone felt good about that solution. Some other things, I know I'm kind of going off script a little bit. I want to make sure I'm reading from my slide too, just in case people need to do those. But I want to give another example that could be helpful with, when there's a student in a class that perhaps is asking a lot of questions. And as an instructor or professor, you don't want to disrupt that engagement, yet it's taking up a lot of time in the class, and how to approach. And again, I think going to the student or coming to CDR and saying, can you assist in this situation? Then coming up with a plan with the student. So if a student is asking a lot of questions and talking a lot and disrupting the flow of a lecture, then we can come up with a solution together, and it's a collaborative effort. For instance, we might, talk to the student and say, it's great you're asking questions. Let's do this. Let's give you time to ask, give them a number, 2 or 3 questions during lecture, and then use office hours for the rest of the questions. So these are those are just some examples that I can also provide. Let me move to the next slide. I just wanted to provide all of our contact info, and just so everyone is aware, and I think people are aware, that when students register with the Center for Disability Resources, they have an access coordinator who they work directly with. And another thing is, we always have an access coordinator available on call. And we're really moving from this one-on-one, like a student has to work with a particular person, to allowing students, just another measure of universal design is if you need something now, we have somebody available right now. Or if you have a particular type of issue and you want to speak to somebody different than your access coordinator, you have access to that person. So I wanted just to share all the emails on our contact info, and I just want everyone to know that they're welcome to work with our office whenever there might be times when you want to collaborate with the student to come up with some ideas of how to best especially implement this universal design practice in the classroom with students. And then I'll turn it back over to Christy.
Great. I want to thank each of the panelists for giving that sort of overview of a little bit of framing, a little bit of experience, a little bit about UDL, and a little bit about CDR. What we really, though, want to do with the remainder of time that we have is open it up to your questions. We will supplement with some other ideas as needed, but we're really interested. We know folks came here for a particular reason. So what questions do you have? You may either... Oh, thank you. Yes, here's another resource slide. Thank you. All of this will be in the presentation, that you'll be able to get access to these resources, but I wanted to point that out. What would you want to know? And you may either put your questions in chat, and my colleague Beth Myers is monitoring that. You may also use the hand raise function if you would like. And we can try to target this part of the discussion around the needs of the group here.
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to all of our presenters, our panelists. You did a fantastic job. Thank you, Christy, for that framing. It really started us off. And thanks, everyone else. This was really helpful. I can start us off with a question. Oh, good. This is great to go back to the whole group so we can all see each other. But I'll take some questions from the chat, but I'm going to start us off with a question. Actually, I'm going to start with Nate. Nate, can you maybe give us an idea of something that might have helped you as an undergrad, thinking back to your undergrad experience? What's something that might have helped you that faculty could know?
Definitely. And my response to that question is not so much on the academic side, but more so for students who are looking to live on campus and, in the residential dorms. I think that it would have been helpful for the residential staff to know that there are some students on campus who might experience a bit of anxiety with the various aspects of residential life, especially with that transition from high school to college, living away from home, like being around like a whole group of new people, and some of these people who you're living with might not necessarily have as much knowledge and experience of neurodiversity and the kind of labels that follow under that umbrella. I think just having understanding that that might be a bit of a process and might be difficult to navigate at the very beginning, and I think for me that got better with time, but just at the very beginning, just kind of having that understanding that there might be some students on campus who struggle with that might be very helpful, very useful, especially as it relates to what we're talking about earlier as it relates to kind of events or social events for neurodiverse students. So
That's really helpful. Thanks, Nate.
of course.
Amy's asking in the chat, could you please speak on how to approach students who have not disclosed any neurodivergence, but who you think would benefit from additional support? I don't know, Judy or William, do you want to talk about that, or even Christy?
I can talk about it from a faculty perspective, and then I would really love to hear from Judy or William to add to this. One of the things I do right up front is in my introduction to the course, in my syllabus, and in my introduction of myself, is I really talk about, and I actually have a Google form that students can fill out where I ask them, tell me something about yourself that what would help make your experience of this course most successful. And I give examples, and I'll talk about, you're going to notice I pace around the room a lot. That's I have to keep moving to be able to be fun, to be able to be comfortable in this space. I also talk about I'm really sensitive to perfume and chemicals, so please don't do those in this space because it makes it hard for me to breathe. So I try to model showing things that are hard, that I might be dealing with or that might make my use of this space more comfortable. So I do that up front, and I provide a way for students to do that through a Google form. I also I try to frame it around, if I notice the student might be struggling, might be having trouble keeping up with the assignments, or they might be struggling understanding the syllabus. So whether I think it has to do with neurodiversity or some other issue, I'll ask to speak with the student and say, hey, I noticed that you've been having trouble getting work turned in. Let's talk about your process. What would help you feel more confident or comfortable? Do we look at how you're scheduling things? So I try to frame it around a need as opposed to a particular identity. But I do think that having that recognition of, hey, it seems like you might be struggling with this. Can we talk about how best I could structure what's happening here to support you? Judy or William, you want to add to that?
I will add to that. I think that's a perfect way of putting it, is really considering the need and not the identity. I work with so many students who do not want to identify as neurodiverse. Every student is different. And I do think, depending upon what's going on, the best way to address it is to be direct, and also to ask, what kinds of resources are you using here on this campus? What are you aware of? And because a lot of times students are connected with our office. I know faculty and TAs will get letters, accommodation letters. Sometimes students are connected, but they don't renew letters, and so a particular faculty may not be aware of their connection with our office, and that could just remind them to reconnect if they would think it would be useful.
Great, thank you. Thanks, I think that was really helpful. What about this next question from Michelle Combs? It's a question about implementing UDL in more of like non-humanities courses, things like the hard sciences. It says a lot of these seem like they would be easier to implement in humanities courses, but more challenging in hard sciences like biology or physics or computer science. Are there particular tips for those kinds of classes? And in the parentheses, it says maybe the full UDL documentation covers this. William, are you able to talk about that, to talk about UDL in other settings, or maybe this is something that someone else could discuss?
Can you hear me okay, Beth?
Yeah, you broke up for a second there, but now I hear you okay.
All right. With a great question. And my experience, I've had the great experience to provide training to faculty in the use of universal design for learning. And the training has been not targeted at particular disciplines, but for faculty of all disciplines. And we found regularly in doing this type of training where we actually worked with people as they developed particular UDL types of interventions into either one class that they have to teach or into one specific unit that they're teaching, or even into just one lesson that they're teaching. And I can assure you, although I can't provide you great examples just right now, that it works very nicely across the disciplines. And to the extent that you'd like to explore this, yes, the resources that are shared will indeed provide you with some more insights as to how you can use UDL in other types of disciplines. But I also would be happy to consult with you and to help you strategize and think through how to actually bring some UDL into your teaching. That's something that I enjoy doing, and I'd be happy to do that.
I would add to that we did a talk about regarding neurodiversity in biology earlier this year, and folks asked questions about things like lab spaces. How does this apply in a lab? And one of the things we talked about is thinking about a lot of times what students struggle with is sort of the procedures or processes of things, or knowing the order in which to do things, or knowing where to engage. So providing that's where I think that additional structure can be helpful. Almost coming up with, these are the steps in this process, and thinking about how someone's going to engage with that process. Being intentional about grouping and intentional about what you're expecting for students when they're working with other people, giving choice in how that happens. But yes, we often think, oh, I can't do UDL in a science class because there's content they have to know. Well, of course there is, but that doesn't mean we can't think about different ways that students can reflect and demonstrate that understanding, or different scaffolds that we can put in place to help provide structure.
Yeah, that's great. Christy, do you know if that presentation in science was recorded?
That's a great question. I do not know that, but I will find that out.
Okay, that would be great. It would be nice if people could access that now. Yeah. Okay. And then Carly dropped a link in here about UDL, which is really helpful. Thank you. UDL training. Dana asks, what are the thoughts? Oh, we appreciate the shout out here. I'm grateful to have the insight and resources available to support our capacity building as faculty and staff. What are the thoughts about peers? Great question, particularly in social and interpersonal engagements. Is there anybody that
Should I add more to that?
I think we understand the question. I'm just wondering who would be interested in talking about it.
Nate, do you want to take this one first?
Can you repeat the question? I apologize.
Yeah. What about peers? What about supporting peers, particularly in social and interpersonal engagements?
So supporting peers, so peers of neurodiverse students? That is a good question. I would say just, so I'm trying to think of a way to do that that would not be kind of, that is because that's something, that's an angle that we usually think about supporting the students themselves, so supporting the peers as well. I would say.
Do you want to think on that and then we'll come back to you?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I know one of the things that we we do some peer training and peer support in Inclusive U when we're thinking about peer supports. But I think one of the things is really about sort of setting the expectation for everyone that everyone belongs. And then I think, that's one of the things that I'd sort of like to start off with, is that that disability is part of our diverse community at Syracuse University, and that diversity, that kind of diversity, is really important to us. And then when we model that for students and have it as sort of one of our expectations at the university, that I think that that's one of the ways that becomes sort of really supportive for students. And I think is really also important to our sort of philosophical stance of inclusion at the university. So that's sort of the first piece that I would like to kind of put out there. When we have really high expectations for students and sort of this inclusive stance, I think that students often rise to that. But I do think that there are ways that we also need to support students in sort of their interpersonal skills in much the ways that we need to support all students, right? That they're many of our students, not all, but many of our students are young adults who are still learning good interaction skills with one another. And there are supports at the university to be able to build up those skills, like students who are in residence life. There are supports for those. And so kind of connecting students into that. But sometimes as faculty, sometimes students need some support in the classroom even to interact. I think sometimes our students need us to even go an extra level. I would give an example of instead of just saying in a classroom, everybody choose a group partner. It's often a lot easier, particularly for our neurodiverse students, if we put some structure to that. So if we help students select, for example, I'll put out a Google Doc that says, please select your top 3 topics, and then I'll pair people up based on their selections. And then I'll kind of do that behind the scenes so that students don't have to try to navigate that sort of both social and academic scene on their own in a way that might be difficult for people. That was a really great question. Nate, did you have something you wanted to add to it?
Definitely. I think just to kind of like go off of what you're saying, just when it comes to starting it from the beginning, I would say kind of making that like in as informal of a way as possible, like making that part of new student orientations, for example, but the thing is, the thing that I would kind of have to emphasize is to do that without being patronizing or saying like, oh, you have to support these students kind of thing, or trying to make it seem like it's forced, or just kind of, and I think saying that in general terms, like you're saying, where it's like, oh, we're a diverse community and we value that as part of the institution. I think that's something that is essential in that regard, so it doesn't really single any one person out.
Yeah. Judy.
We definitely have some work to do with the student body as a whole in terms of helping our young members of this campus community to have a better understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means amongst their peers. We've got work to do, and I know. I work with Dana, so we have come across some situations where, we've been challenged, and we recognize that this is a work in progress. And I think we've always felt this way. But I think, we've got, I think we've got a lot of good resources, and we've got a lot of interest from, I think, the faculty, staff, the administration of this university, it's really about changing culture, and inclusion, and really having our students, I think our students are, they feel secure and happiest when there's a sense of inclusion, and everyone wants to be included. So I think, getting that, like teaching those methods throughout our curriculums, all curriculums, would be really helpful. And so some of your practical examples in the classroom are really helpful.
Judy, I think that's so important. And I actually want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. One of your examples was, for example, a student who asks a lot of questions or talks a lot in class. I think we also have to recognize, as we're thinking about creating spaces that are supportive of neurodiverse students, we have to recognize those students are in a classroom community with other students. And we have to make sure that we're supporting the needs of the whole community. And so, you know, I can picture a perfect example of this. I had a student who identified as autistic, and this particular student monopolized every conversation for the first part of the semester. And it was really hard because I wanted to respect that the student had a huge, we were talking about inclusion and diversity. They had this life experience to share, but they actually started shutting down other students' comments or different life experiences. And so I let it go for a while because I was trying to be really respectful, and then I realized, first of all, that's not respectful to the rest of my class. And it's not respectful to that student because the other students are starting to get really, really annoyed. So we had to have a real honest conversation. And I said, hey, this is your life experience. It's super valued, and we want to make space for it as much as we can. But this student's life experience is different. We have to make space for that too. So we came up with strategies for how, you know, cues. And this student really asked me to say, let me know when I'm going too far. So it was during Zoom time. So I was able to private message and say, hey, let's wait now. And then I met with that student every week to talk about other issues that they had a chance to kind of air their feelings. So I think recognizing we have to think about the needs of our entire community and sometimes have those tough conversations like we would with any student. That's respect. It isn't respectful to just ignore things that are creating fissures in your community. I see a great question from Jamie about social media. I was actually thinking about that, Jimmy, as we think about how do you change a culture on campus? One of the ways we do that is by changing representation, by thinking about what goes into our media. What do we use when we, you know, who are the examples of what an SU student is? Does that include students who are neurodiverse in our marketing materials, right? Like what image are we putting out into the world about what it means to be a Syracuse University student? There are some fabulous documentaries that show a really different view on the autistic and neurodiverse experience than what you might see in mainstream media. And we can make some of those resources available to folks if they're interested. There's some really wonderful ones.
Yeah, it would be great for us to put some of those together and send them out. Yeah. There are some fun ones too, right? It's fantastic to see how that landscape has changed over the last decade. Yeah. I think we probably only have time for one more question, and I'm really interested in Mary's question about understanding neurodiversity and changing grading. So I'm wondering if either William or Judy want to take that one up.
Would you repeat the question, Beth?
How does understanding neurodiversity change our grading?
Well, I would start by saying that neurodiversity doesn't change our expectations as instructors for what we want our students to learn and to be able to demonstrate and to use in their life. It doesn't change expectations, but it may change the way we set up an assessment that will, in a sense, measure their understanding of a particular construct or something. We don't always have to, as I mentioned earlier, resort to a particular type of assessment. When we give, especially we give our students opportunities for choosing the manner in which they want to respond. And think about experiential things, such as being able to demonstrate through perhaps a portfolio type of response. We're giving students opportunities to choose what's going to work best for them. We don't change the expectations, so I start by setting up a rubric to begin with of what I'm looking for students, and then allow students to choose one of maybe several approaches to getting to that, to getting to those expectations. That's kind of my take on it from a more UDL perspective.
That's a great answer, William. Thank you so much. Yeah, it is really one of the wonderful things about higher ed, right, is that we have a little bit of academic freedom to select our own assessments in many of our classes. We get to design our classes. We get to design our coursework. We get to make some decisions about what we want from students, and we have a little bit of freedom and flexibility in many of our classes, maybe not all, but in many of our classes, to be able to design things in different ways. And we can make changes to our syllabi in ways that are responsive to our students, which is actually a really wonderful thing. Okay, so we are just about out of time. I want to thank everyone for the fantastic discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists. I also really want to thank people who are not our panelists, but are dropping all kinds of resources into the chat. We will send out this discussion. We will send out some resources to everyone who signed up today. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for your interest in this topic. We are really impressed with all of you for being here and for your commitment to inclusion and your commitment to neurodiversity. And we appreciate you. Chrissy,
I would
anything to
add, I would just add, if there are things that would be helpful for you, if there are additional workshops or presentations that you would like, please let us know that. We are really eager to be responsive to the community and trying to help make this a really inclusive, positive climate for all of our students, including students that are neurodiverse. So thank you all so much. I want to thank my panelists, Judy and Nate and William, and a big shout out to Beth for moderating, and of course to Carly Grafassi behind the scenes for making all of this work so smoothly. I want to thank everyone for being here. Have a fabulous rest of the day and a fabulous weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Recording stopped.